Hello and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is our third and final CNHP reads, um, Climate Justice in Short Fiction for Spring 2022. So now let me quickly introduce just our moderators for today's discussion. Um, we have Dr. Jesse Ballenger and Dr. Sharrona Pearl. And welcome, and let me throw it over to Jesse and Sharrona. Take it away.
Thanks, Darren. We'd like to begin with a moment of silence just to acknowledge the lives lost in yet another two horrific mass shootings in this country, and the pain that people may be feeling. And we would make some space to talk about that for a little bit if people want to begin that. But let's start with a moment of silence just to acknowledge the lives that were lost and the pain that people may be feeling at this moment. So I don't know if anyone has something they want to say about that, but again, I thought we thought we would just make some space for that at the beginning of this event, if people want to.
Something I've been struggling with since we're kind of talking about it is how to calibrate all of these competing urgencies. And I wrote a little bit about this in the context of masking recently. How do you calibrate the vast environmental detritus and waste of the disposable mask against the urgency of saving lives? And a part of me, it just is continually, it doesn't have to be an either or, but when we have these horrific events of racial violence, and it's urgent and needs to be dealt with immediately. And then we're coming here, we're going to talk about climate crisis, which we absolutely should and must. And, my kids are kind of, they want to take on everything, but they're also like, if we're not talking about climate crisis, what are we even doing? Like, our world is actually going to end. And yet in the meantime, there are all of these other things to confront and encounter. I don't have an answer for that, but it feels like it's really hard to figure out how to calibrate all of these urgencies.
I absolutely agree, and I've been thinking lately that we're kind of challenged to like a new way of thinking that isn't focused and isn't reified. I guess I'm saying, ironically, when we all know how rough digital distraction is and everything, but in an odd way, it feels like the way we have to deal with these multiple things at once. I don't have much sense to offer beyond that, but I have been thinking about the same thing. How do you keep the attention that all of these things merit together? And I think the ways you have to start thinking about how they're all connected, how they're all really part of the same experience and part of the same world, and start to think about how what we do in one to address one crisis affects and is part of the way we address another. So
that's really interesting, because we went to the abortion rights rally on Saturday morning, and something that really frustrates my partner, neither of us are American, is the way that, all these other issues get folded into these interventions, right? Not just, of course, people are going to be there canvassing for what they believe in, but the speakers are always tying in together all of these different urgent, but differing opinions, and you might not agree with all of them either, right? Like a union organizer got up and talked about how this is an urgent issue for unions, right? And sure, I agree, but probably lots of people in the unions, this isn't going to be their number one priority, right? But you're sort of making the case to say, well, it's not just a question of intersectionality as a way to understand the differential ways that navigating the world as, for example, a woman of color might impact you, but it's
Yep.
actually a coping mechanism
Yeah, coping mechanism,
or
and
strategy.
I think the only way forward. I don't think we don't really have the luxury of focus anymore.
Right.
We have the luxury of focusing on one thing, and that's all we can think about. So I
Yeah.
don't know.
I was actually going to chime in and say that big aspect now of I know people who are like studying to become environmental scientists, for example, and a big aspect of a lot of coursework now is to interconnect content that you're learning with other major issues. And so I think I mean I agree with Dr. Ballenger in that I feel like things are not it's almost like the only way to handle things is by trying to connect all these issues together. Otherwise, things just get ignored.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, but I also think I don't think it's forced. I think everything is related to each other. A lot of the world conflict happening in the world right now is related to natural resources and
Mhm.
and territory and land, and all that stuff matters in the environmental sense just as much as the political.
Mhm.
So do you think, I mean, we didn't plan this, but the narrative of this story is a little more freewheeling than some of the other ones that we've had, right? It's not quite a stream of consciousness, but it's kind of a present tense set of reflections. Do you think there's a way that that's in part a response to kind of so much stimulus and so many things to navigate? Maybe not.
I I'm not thinking about myself. I'm going to sit with that question for a while. Maybe. I mean, it's interesting. Fiction is interesting in that it's always it is a response to like a kind of total moment, and it's always interesting. I'm not a literary studies person, but I read these people, and I mean, one of the modes of analysis is to think about how something which might not appear to be a response to something going on in the society at the time, nonetheless can be seen. The writer can be seen working those things out in their narratives, and so I think probably there is something to that, but I can't like haven't thought about it till we got here now.
Yeah, I mean, me neither in terms of that particular
Yeah.
question. Do folks have any responses to the story in the first instance? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Did you read it in English or Spanish? What did you think of that? Did anyone read the translator's note? Just some kind of general thoughts about it.
I can jump in. And I'm so sorry I was a little late.
No
Lord,
worries.
I'm a staff member. Hello. I work here. And I'm Puerto Rican and I love translation. And I actually have a literature background. Funny enough, that's why I'm staff and not faculty here. And I think about the translation between English and Spanish and Mexican stories, specifically like Chicano and Chicana literature into America and English speaking United States all the time. So I have endless things to say, and I'm just so grateful that this was on the bill, as they say. But my first question was, well, not question, but like something to offer is, are we familiar, just like this group of who's here today, with the concept of magical realism as a literature genre? Yeah, I wonder about
Yes.
that
Yeah.
in here because to my understanding, if anyone knows the name Isabel Allende, who's a writer and an author who wrote The House of Spirits and all this, to me, Gabriel Garcia Marquez does this too in shorter stories, but to me, it sometimes feels like one way to address perhaps trauma in literature. We know that the neuroscience of trauma affects the brain and time and space and like how we process confusing inputs. We think about stories coming from places with turmoil and climate change being a great example. Things are changing faster than we can keep up with it. And I appreciate that the story reflects that. And the way we're looking at the story too seems extra unique, that some of us may be English speakers, some of us may or may not be Spanish speakers or have any understanding of like what a bilingual identity might feel like in terms of reading stories. And as someone who does speak Spanish and studies what the power that the translator has, I found that's what I was thinking about when I read this. I thought specifically about like how in the email for this event and in the social media for it, it said, this is a story called Seed. It's not called Seed, technically. The title of the story is in its original language and it has been translated to mean seed, But that's just one way of approach. And that's what I think about as someone who does speak Spanish. And I just really want to honor that as a language and like originally what it was written in. And what I find most interesting about Spanish to English translation that I think is applicable here, and I think is in the translator's note, is the idea of how gender works in the Spanish language versus the English language. And it gets even more complicated when we think about how not everyone speaks Spanish, even if they do today, living in Central and South America, like it wasn't the first language of these regions. So I guess what I have to share is, yes, I too am thinking so many thoughts at once, as our writer seems to be as well. So I'm just wondering about like if it is magical realism to some degree, or if we want to use that as an interpretive lens, what could that mean? Like, what are the moments of magic, quote unquote, in this story? And do those feel really relevant to the themes of climate change? Like, what could she be trying to say about climate change by using a really magical or confusing or, I don't know, something different than a linear narrative to talk about something that we don't fully understand that's happening right now, climate change? I'm not sure if that was useful or just a lot of new ideas as well.
No, that's interesting to me. I actually didn't
sitting
read
with
it as
it.
magical realism.
Interesting. How so?
I mean, I actually thought it was metaphor. For me, magical realism isn't necessarily about, well, we're talking about thing X, but really it's representing thing Y. To me, this was actually less about a mode of magical realism as a fantastical intervention, and actually like, and we can dig into it, and maybe others disagree, but I think these were kind of really powerful metaphors about how climate crisis can create, such deep distinctions between people and species, and how if there is a chance of anything happening, any kind of salvation, it's doesn't seem like it's coming from within. And also, like the eating dirt story, that to me felt like just a really kind of powerful claim for the ways in which we misrecognize the earth. Although I don't know, one of the questions that Abdullah came up with that might be a good place to dig into this a little bit is around this kind of question of the damage happened to people and not fabrics. And I don't know if that's one of the things that felt magical realism to you, or metaphorical, but what sense did people make of that?
Could I just throw, before we go, I think that's a great place to go, but I want to throw one connecting, because I went back and forth as I read this twice in the last 2 days, just because I think it is hard to sort of, it's a great story in the sense of it. I think it resists the sort of places people tend to put there. Like when I read a lot of literature from authors in Latin America, I do think, okay, I'm ready for magical realism, and I think there are elements of it there, but it also, I also thought, but this is kind of pretty straight speculative fiction. And I would just throw out the one idea, the famous idea from Arthur C. Clarke, that any sort of technology, if sufficiently advanced, was his way, is indistinguishable from magic. The corollary I would put is any sort of scientific principle insufficiently understood is indistinguishable from magic as well. So part of the narrative's experience certainly is that this seems magical to her and seems to challenge her ways. But anyway, that's just an idea I want to put out there.
I was also going to chime in and say the idea of like magical realism actually didn't even jump into my mind. I guess for me, what jumped out to me was the way that I don't know how to describe the entity, the being, the other person, not the narrator. The way they talked reminded me a lot about like the way science fiction novels and short stories and stories in general often talk to people as if like, oh, not talking down to necessarily, but like of just another level of understanding. It reminded me a lot about how in science fiction stories often about like aliens and extraterrestrials and things like that, that's typically the tone, the way of speaking is always more I'm above you or I know something that you don't.
I think that tone and the relationship I think that is a crucial thing. There's a claim of moral superiority, I think, that the creature has, and knowledge superiority that has to sort of that feels like that what the story's about. But I feel like you had raised a promising question, Sharrona, and
Well, it's Abdullah's
I
question.
might go ahead. Okay, Abdul's question. Can you reiterate it though? Because I feel like I muddied it.
Well, first of all, I think this is really interesting, and I like the kind of productive tension between Izzy's kind of provocation that this is magical realism, and you're saying, well, but the ambiguity about magical realism is itself a potential device. Is it actually magic here, or is it just the limitations of our own knowledge, right? And there's so much that we are limiting ourselves on purpose from knowing too, especially in this particular arena, right? We are lying the heck out of this impending crisis, right? So it's almost like this deliberate obfuscation. But the question was and maybe we can actually actualize this kind of question around what might be one of these elements, which is some sort of force that damages skin but not clothing, which is something that we hear about at the beginning of the story. So what do we think that is, if anything?
I personally feel it has to be something about Indigenous land rights and the climate change crisis, because the reason why I bring up magical realism is I looked up this author. Let me pull up again because I'm for Iliana Vargas. Yeah. So I was just drawn to it because Vargas is a name in my family as well. And I was like, I know a Vargas. That's my aunt. So I looked her up. And she does go to like Chicano literary festivals. This tells me she may be working in this literary genre. And what is really important to remember there is the idea of like Indigenous heritage in Central South America and in the Caribbean. And when we talk about the climate change crisis, something I know and I talk about with others and hear about from others is just the idea of like Indigenous communities were here before colonization was, and they were excellent stewards of this land. And to me, a metaphor of it hurts my skin more than it hurts my clothing feels like it's saying something about colorism, about the color of one's skin, about shades. This is something that affects my family all the time because I am from very rural Puerto Rico, but it just so happens that on my father's side, there's enough Spanish colonizer that this happens to be the color of my skin, but it's not. My family reunions look very different than I look in front of you now. And that has shaped how I've been treated in the world versus how every other person I love and am related to is treated. And I'm just wondering about these intersections of like identity, race, for lack of a better term, Indigenous rights, and the climate change crisis. They all kind of collapse on each other because it's this idea of like, when we cause harm, what are we harming? Something external like a shirt or a sweater that we could take off. Even undergarments could be harmed. You can't take off your skin without hurting your ability to survive. You could get an infection, you get a cut. We think about healthcare and health equity at the College of Nursing and Health Professions. And I don't know, this is a lot of associative ideas, sort of a mind map for us all right here. But to me, if I'm hearing a metaphor about something as rich and poetic as the story we just read, and of all the words they said, they were very intentional about saying the clothing is torn, or the skin is torn, not the clothing. It really feels like the author wants to push us to go just one step deeper and thinking about this question of harm, and quote unquote, how deep does it go? Like, we can say we're sorry, but lots of drippy metaphors about scar tissue maybe come to mind here. That it happened. We have to remember it happened because a scar is great. It's your body healing. But because you were hurt, maybe, is a simple way to think about such an enormous concept.
That's really provocative, Izzy. Did anybody else have a read on that particular device?
My quick opinion was like, or what I thought of when I read that was a lot about materialism and how a lot of the things that we utilize on a daily basis don't decompose, um, or won't decompose for a very long time. And so I thought of maybe that being as sort of like a method to bring up how, climate change and this hurt and this like the pain is going to affect us, and one day we won't be here, but the fabric or like the clothing, it'll still be there one way or another. It's not going to be the, I don't know how to describe this, like the sense that I'm getting from this, but essentially I felt like that's what they were hinting at, that they were looking at, the author was trying to maybe bring light to this idea of how we're very materialistic, but a lot of the things that we utilize, they're not the things that are going to be affected by climate change as much as we are. They'll be there. They won't decompose. I mean, and that's a problem. That's a problem of environmental damage. But I think that, I don't know, to me that it reminded me of that. I just was reading an article about how many things that are going to have hundreds of years or thousands of year life cycles before they eventually decompose, and it's not things that very few people have. It's things that we all have in our households, that things that most likely won't decompose. So I mean, that's what I kind of thought of.
Yeah, my brain was moving in similar directions, really reflecting a little bit more on what's really being damaged here, right? And where are we putting our values? So we pour all this money and attention into producing these fabrics, which is part of the problem, right? It's part of the thing that's causing this overproduction. It's part of what's causing the environmental crisis, although far from the only thing. And we're trading off our own health and well-being for it. So we're saying that thing, these clothes, which are resilient and going to be okay, we have traded off our own health and safety. And that's sort of the choice we have made. We have said we would rather, create an environment in which we cannot be sustained in order to have this stuff.
I feel like clothing is a really apt metaphor for the climate crisis when I think about just another buzzword like fast fashion. But what I mean there is we used to have to sew our clothing by hand, and now we don't. We don't need to, per se, on a societal level, for every single person to have clothing. Like we have sewing machines, that was a big thing. And now, like the factory where they are made, and now those factories aren't in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking about how in Mexico and other countries, even in my own home as a kid, I grew up in New England, my Grammy who sews, like I learned how to sew a shirt from fabric, but I didn't have to weave the fabric. We did have to do that as well. So it's just this interesting moment of like, when we think of human progress in society, I really value and I'm so grateful for all the tools we have today that can facilitate important conversations about how to treat others. And also maybe we take for granted like that we used to have to make all this from scratch, and that maybe there's some big reflexive metaphor there about treating others well, treating our earth well. Like to take care of our earth, we have to take care of the people. I think it's this sort of interest, everything Abdullah was saying of we're materialistic, these items will not decompose, but human bodies will, and yet we're a human society. So it's this kind of contradictory metaphor question that like the human body is actually very organic, it will decompose, but we're making all these things that will outlive us, our cell phones, my dress from Target that I'm wearing, the hair dye, my hair is not pink when it comes out of my head. Like these things hurt the planet. But sometimes we do these things we dress a certain way, we express ourselves a certain way, we have certain items in our home to be identified with who we are. But we're also thinking about how we also exist on this earth and the climate needs our help too. It's just the phrase that's coming to mind is like, this is an impossible question. But the earth does exist, I guess. And like we do have people on it. So that's why I'm finding this story very, very interesting. And especially the fact that it's translated on the language level of like the poetics of translating a language, and on the cultural level, that stories written in different cultures, sort of quote unquote, reflect a different set of ideals from the storytellers who live there. I just find that all very, very interesting. And it feels like it's all part of this, even if it's ultimately talking about like, reduce, reuse, recycle, like simple things that add to big things for how do we get our heads around the climate crisis and like what our next steps are so that we have an earth to continue to live on for everyone,
I really love the conversation about the clothes. I feel like we might be reading some practicality into it that I'm not sure the author is going there, because the other place I would take it was, and this would connect back to I think the point Izzy started with about skin and the importance of skin, because one of the things is that's striking is not only do these things not really damage the clothes, they don't, whatever these ineffable shards of, I really have a hard time figuring out what those things are, but they don't harm the creature, the creature, person, certainly a person, the other being, and part of what is so strange to the narrator about this other person is, as she gets closer, her appearance, the small insects crawling over her face, the greenness of her teeth, that I think she's got dirt in her mouth when she first comes. I guess what I'm feeling there is some sense about alienation and about a modern, the modern human being's alienation from the earth, and sort of the fragility of a modern skin, needing to be covered, being vulnerable to its own, its own excesses. Like this is kind of what I was feeling it. And I feel like the vulnerability of the modern, the modern human being's skin to what they're, whatever environmental, and I think it's referred to this way, the sort of whatever is unleashed by their violence, their processes. This other being is not vulnerable in the same way. They're sort of part of it. They're not differentiated from the earth in the same way. And I also love the whole talk about food, and like you don't know what you could eat, and the being is like, why, why is it strange to you to eat the earth and all the things that are in the earth? And the other person was like, well, it's just weird for me to think about eating something that's under my feet. Like that was pretty amazing language. I don't know what it's like in Spanish, but that in translation, that was an amazing thing. I don't know.
What do you think about that though, Jess? What do you think? I mean, it is actually weird for us to think about eating dirt, right?
We're gonna all be
we
eating
can't
dirt.
actually,
You
like,
know that. That's the only way forward.
right. Well, we're gonna have to eat the stuff in the dirt, right? But we
Yes.
can't actually eat dirt,
Eat
right?
dirt,
Like
right.
only
right.
those of us with pica eat dirt. Like,
But dirt is a living thing. I mean, one of the asking, I'm way over my head here, but soil is not. We think of dirt as not alive. That's totally nonsense. It's completely alive, and you can talk about healthy soil and living soils. And I think this story, without being like real sciencey, gets at that reality.
so did you have like resonances of actually we're all going to eat crickets and locusts because these are the best forms of protein now, and we're running?
I do, and I think also the sadness, the sort of tragedy and sadness of this story is how cut off we are from that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
They do eat crickets in Mexico as like a delicacy. In Oaxaca, Mexico, the cricket is very, very common in local cuisine. And so that's what I just find so interesting, that like at the same time that we're having these really highbrow scientific conversations about the future of protein, the future of food in the US, like Michael Pollan and, Food Inc.,
yeah.
things like this, there's folk wisdom to it.
Sure.
We're kind of going back to nature.
Yeah.
Isn't that a phrase we have?
I saw, I'm sorry to interrupt, Izzy, but I saw Donna, you had your you unmuted for a second. So if you want to, I just want to make sure that other people get a chance to speak. So please, if that's what that was about.
So I was responding to, this is Donna. Hi. Sorry, my camera's not on. I'm at work, so I don't have a camera on my computer. But I wanted to, join in on this. I just wanted to touch back what Dr. Ballenger said about, about the eating the dirt. So it's because I've read the story when you first sent it out in the email, and then I, reread it before this, before this lunchtime. And I think the lines that stuck out to me was when the other being, was saying, eating the earth isn't bad for me. And it's just the way it was written. It was like, is it eating her bad for you? When she asked the young man, is it bad for you? To me, I took it as like she's literally eating the dirt, but I don't think he sees that he's eating the earth up. Like he's, you know, I guess I'm thinking about that as we're not taking care of the earth. Like you may not be literally eating the dirt, but you are eating the earth up by what you're doing. So that's how I kind of took, that interaction about, when she asked him, doesn't it, isn't it bad for you? And I don't know. That's how I took it. I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great reading. It's sort of saying, you think we're so different.
Mm-hmm.
We're both consuming, we're both operating in modes of consumption, but yours is perhaps violent or unconsidered or not really taking into account the value of this thing. It wouldn't have occurred to me, but I think that's a really beautiful reading. And it also ties in a little bit to what Izzy was saying about stewardship and responsible land use.
Can I ask about what line are we looking at here? Like, what's the phrase?
I think because that's what I had underlined. It was just their interaction where she said, "Isn't eating earth bad for you?" And it says, "I finally asked her between nervous laughs, no, is eating her bad for you?" And the way they italicized that, it just caught my eye. I guess why is that in italics? I guess, and I was like, well. They're literally eating the dirt, but he's literally eating up the earth because of, his actions, or, not putting all the blame on him because of course he says, I just inherited this. I mean, not saying he's not responsible, but we're not fixing the problem.
It's so interesting to me because I feel like that's a perfect example of what's lost in translation. Because the Spanish, to be very literal, if we were to put it in English literally, it just wouldn't read nicely in how we speak English in 2022. It literally means when she says, "Isn't eating earth bad for you?" That's what we say in English. But what she literally asks is, "Does it not hurt you, the earth?" And the response is, "No, ... And to you, the same." I asked strange, like extrañada, just like strange, curious. Like these are things we don't have words for in English. And it's cultural. I'm sure if we were to read a story written in Farsi that was translated into English, a lot would be lost in translation. And it's a whole area of literature translation. So I just find it so wonderful to be reading this for climate change specifically, as we all do live on the earth in climate change. But conversations about climate change, when they are literally in other languages, I'm curious about what do other cultures think as well. And that's the translator. And that's what's also cool about it, that the translator gets their chance at rewriting this story in English. And yet that will always have an effect on what it means, especially to people who don't speak the original language. I'm sorry, something just fell over in my house. That's what that was, the wind. I don't know, does that change anyone's experience of the story to know that on one version of the story it's written, "Does it not hurt you?" This double negative that we don't do in English. "Does it not hurt you, the earth?" versus "Isn't eating earth bad for you?" Like, does that change that for people? I'm just curious.
I think one thing that I noticed in those particular two sentences, and I don't know if this is because of the translation or because this is what the translator wanted to say, is that he asks her, "Does eating earth hurt you?" But she, in the English translation, says, "No, but does eating her hurt you. And I think that personification of calling Earth her, as in like Mother Earth, or some sort of adding a personification to it, gives, to me, it reads like the creature has more respect for the Earth than humans do, just because of how they address the Earth. And I think this also goes back to the point you were making about how Indigenous cultures had so much more respect for nature than modern day humans do, in that if we look at so many Indigenous cultures, a lot of them refer to Earth as Mother Earth, and they have this sort of innate respect for nature and for every aspect of nature. So just seeing how she responds, or the creature responds, with just eating her instead of Earth, it, I don't know if that was something that just showed up in the English translation or also in the Spanish translation, but that was something that also stood out to me.
Yeah, because in Spanish it's la tierra, which is gendered a female Earth, and the Spanish, as in people descended from Spain who speak the Spanish language, Spanish is not the first language of Mexico. Depends on where you are. And from there, it's going to be indigenous words that still stick around today. You know, in Puerto Rico, I'm learning that like iguana is a Taíno word that's still here today that we've all been saying. Isn't that so fun? So yeah, it's just so interesting. And I've always wondered, in languages with gendered language, like Spanish and Romance languages, how do they choose what's feminine and what's masculine for the sake of the gendered pronoun? I don't know, but I do know it's la tierra, which is like the quote unquote feminine Earth. But now in English, we're having lots of conversations about gender and defying binary. And that's a conversation going on in Spanish. And that's why we have the word Latinx right now, which is an attempt to move away from Latino or Latina and try to have a more inclusive term for people of Latin American ancestry, with Latin America also being 26 different countries. So it's just all so complicated. So when, I don't know, we started this conversation saying so much is happening all at once in this story. And I am feeling that to be true. There's just so much going on at once in this story, and made double through translation.
While we're on this kind of question of the Earth and its decay, maybe we'll turn to one of your questions, Vivi, which was, you know, you highlighted this really resonant statement. I hope you don't think I'm not aware that my own decay is part of the Earth's decay, right? And you read that a little bit as almost a defense of indifference. Like, I know and I don't care almost. And that ties back to how we started out this meeting today too, what Jess and I were talking about in terms of how to navigate all of the various struggles and challenges that we have. And of course, the risk, the other side of trying to live and hold space for racial violence and environmental collapse and all these other very serious challenges that are coexisting is to say, yes, I know them all, I can't do anything about it, indifference, right? Or you know, Dr. Ballenger's favorite fatalism, right? And so you're reading this as almost a fatalistic thing, but I know, so it's okay, right? I read it slightly differently, but I'd love to hear more about how you connected with that statement, and you also reflected on that as almost pretty common for people to be like, you know, we know, and there's nothing to be done.
I think, to me, this was the most realistic statement in this whole story, just because of when you go around and talk to someone about climate change, the response you usually get is like, yeah, I know it's bad, but like, what can I do about it? That's a corporation's issue. That's someone else's issue. That's for someone else to deal with. Or the idea that like, oh, climate change is irreversible versus isn't irreversible. That's the conversation people want to have, not the conversation of something is happening now and we can do something to fix it now. So when I read that statement, it immediately put me back to several conversations I've had in my own life about climate change, and about how I've said something like, I've mentioned to a friend like, hey, maybe we should recycle this water bottle. And she said, why does it matter? Because I mean, it's all going to end up in a landfill anyway. So things like, even if we know we're trying, does it really make a difference? And so that thing of putting in the effort and seeing that it's not making any difference, is it then worth it to continue trying? So that sort of leads to that indifference. And I think that's the kind of tone that I got of reading that statement, is you put in the effort and then eventually you just give up and decide that it's not worth it anymore. So let's just acknowledge something is wrong and move on and hope the next generation, quote unquote, will take care of it.
Yeah, I almost find myself doing the very same thing sometimes. I'll be honest. You know, somehow as though if you foreground your awareness of a particular problem, it doesn't quite absolve you from having to deal with it, but you know, at least you're sort of demonstrating that you feel appropriately guilty as though that were an action. Is that kind of what you mean?
I think so. I think that's exactly what I was getting at, is like just knowing that it happens is enough to say that, yes, I'm aware and a part of solving the issue, even though it's really not. It's more performative in that sense. But
I was gonna comment and say that it's challenging, I think, to blame people for that mindset of kind of complacency about climate change, just because like it's kind of it is like a loaded statement to say, but you know, it's corporations, this and that. But I mean, it's statistically that's the truth. If everybody started recycling, it would not slow down necessarily the rate of the way things are going, and that's and it's sad to say that, I think it's hard to blame people for feeling like they lack control, and
Yeah, and
because of that they feel like they're stuck.
I think that's a really good point on election day too to bring up, right?
Yes, yeah, 100%.
Like when it
And that
comes to climate
actually,
change, this might actually be the thing that world leaders are much better poised to deal with than us, but actually voting might be effective. I know, Jess, you want to get in, but can I just comment on that really quickly? When I was in grad school, my partner and I really early on were like, we want to buy carbon offsets. You know, we really want to get out ahead of this for our consumption. And we went, I mean, I was a grad student, I didn't have a lot of money, but I went with it with really quite a significant amount of hubris. We didn't own a car. We lived in a small apartment. We brought our own bags even before that was a thing, you know. And again, neither of us are American, and we're like filling it out. We're like, this is great. We're so good. Our footprint's so low. It's not going to cost us a lot of money at all. And then it's like, how many international flights a year do you take? And it turns out we actually could have been trailing plastic bags, wrapping ourselves in toilet paper while driving in circles around the block. And none of that would have even come close to the footprint of one international flight. There is a scale issue.
Something else I do find interesting in trying to really interrogate, like, just especially this passage that we're looking at, this passage of I hope you don't think. I just wonder, the translator, with the reflexive verb in Spanish, you can talk about like this thing happens. And when I'm reading specifically se acumula, like you could say it accumulates terribly around and below her. We know it's her because ella means her. So, but the translator chose to say, what I produce, the waste I produce does this, does that. Do we know that was the intention of the really storyteller? And the reason why I asked that is because that is the moment of dovetail where it could become two different stories. Because we don't know exactly what Iliana Vargas was putting into this, because we have Michelle Mirabella's like translation. And that's really wonderful. And what is lost in translation? I don't know. I genuinely do not know. This is just like a overly maybe pompous poetic question moment. But what I noticed reading the Spanish version of that moment, in addition to the English, is the use of commands as a grammatical thing. And the difference in English, if you were to command someone, don't do this, don't do that, versus I hope you're not doing this, and I hope you're not doing that. Does that feel different? Like, I genuinely am asking that question because I am bilingual and I always have been. So I've always thought like this. And I wonder if someone is only an English speaker, does the phrasing of don't do this, don't do that feel emotionally different than, well, I hope you don't do this and I hope you don't do that? I genuinely don't know. So I'm curious about how that impacts the story and its greater resonances around our takeaways for what we can all do for climate change. Because I think there is something we all can do, of course, just like you were saying, Sharrona, individual choices. but it's like this cost benefit analysis of how much toilet paper do I have to save if BP oil exists? Well, now it feels ineffective. I don't know. There's a lot of different conversations around climate change and just contributing to the cause of helping the earth. I really don't know. I don't know. So I studied English instead of environmental science.
Can I so I do kind of want to endorse what everybody has said over the past few minutes around this question that this passage that VB drew our attention to. And I just want to point out that I think that's the central drama of the story, in the sense that literally what the story is the encounter between two alienated, if not alien, species, and they are judging each other. Specifically, the being says, I am and is taking her the narrator as and evaluating the narrator as a representative of your species. In some cases saying, you're a little better than most of those that I've encountered, like you seem to actually be able to see me, for example. But the stakes are like super high. It's almost like this cosmic encounter that's going to be once in a lifetime. And on that, so like I think it's exactly these questions of, how do you judge me? How does this being judge us? To the sense of whatever we know about this being, we know it's close to the earth. It's not alienated from the earth in the way that we are as moderns. And I just want to draw attention, because time's going real fast, to the last line, which I thought was really, the more I think about it, really quite stunning. So very end of the story, I imagined that she'd heard my thoughts, because in response, a new, icier, and more savage gust of wind whipped me. Again, suggesting that this being is, the narrator is feeling like this being is almost like able to control it, or that it represents the natural forces represented, but urging me to go home and think about what I would do with my life now that I knew other forms of life were possible. I think that is such an incredible, I think, I'm guessing writers spend a lot of time thinking about their last sentence, because it's like the thing that you're going to be left with, like, about this piece, like, forever. And it just seems to me, I think it's so interesting to think about, like, so what is this encounter? It's the narrator learning that other forms of life are possible. Like, that's really intriguing. And I guess I feel like, well, maybe I should just leave it there. I was going to connect this back to actually to magical realism and all that stuff as well, but let me see if anyone wants to react to what I've said already, and then I'll throw the rest of it on if people want, if it seems appropriate. But I just thought that last line, that is literally what happens. And this kind of ironic thing is, if you think about, I guess when I read that line the second or third time, I thought to myself, it's somewhat ironic, because, we're reading it in the science fiction story, or magical realism story, and I think and/or is correct. And it sort of wakes us up to the strangeness of the world, and that there are these other things possible. We know this, like what's in, like, you could go out in your yard now and find something fully as strange and hard to understand as this being, but we, like, I don't know. That's,
Well, I was going to comment and say that this, that last line that line solidified for me that this felt like a science fiction story, just because of just the way that they said forms of life were possible. To me, it reminded me exactly of a lot of different science fiction stories that I've read, and also just some like scientific theories that we have about, like, extraterrestrials and aliens, that says it's probably not a really good thing to be discovered if there's life out there by other beings. Because I mean, we don't know if other living beings think like us, and this story reflects that. The other being doesn't think like humanity does, and the waste of our environment is something that they judge very heavily for. And so it's a similar concept in science in a lot of people who theorize about life in space, is that we would be judged probably very heavily for our abuse of our planet and our environment. And it just it definitely just made it solidified that concept to me, that um that this like you just said, this is something that we could do on a daily basis. I mean, we do this with race, with with a lot of different things, that it's almost like different forms of life, that things can flip on their heads very quickly and change our perspective on things.
I think that's a really good place to start to draw this to a close. Um, I don't know. I thank you all for going on this journey with us. Jess and I had last year talked about having a kind of the importance of having some collective reading and shared exchange of ideas, not just as a way to bring the college together and not just as a way to highlight these issues that we both care a great deal about, but because there is value in sitting and sharing ideas and sitting with great works of art, sitting with literature and encountering the world in these ways and forcing us to think about things a bit differently. So we were really grateful. I want to acknowledge that we did receive a grant from the Office of Global Programs to support this. And we had wonderful students working with us. So thank you, Vivi and Abdullah, for all your hard work. And those of you who participated may not know that Vivi and Abdullah work on some sort of representation of our discussions afterwards and have produced some beautiful work. So we'll have one of those coming up soon about today's discussion as well. Jess?
I can't think of anything else that must be said. Thank you. But just to reiterate the thanks to our students, and thanks, for everybody who's taken part in this series. It's been a lot of fun, and yeah.
And thanks, of course, to Darren and
Yes.
everybody in the team there from the Tuesday Topics team and the IT team who have made everything run flawlessly, even in very challenging situations. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks at the next Tuesday Topics.